Great to have you guys here. This panel is the panel I've been looking forward to the most personally, and we've really assembled the Avengers of psychedelics. So with that, I think a good place to start would be to go down the line. Love to hear from you three how you got into psychedelics. What was the catalyst for you? And then spend just a minute, a bit about the companies that you're working on and or investing in. Rick, why don't you kick us off?
Well, MAPS that I started in 1986 was our 38th year, and our 38th anniversary was on the April 8th, which was the solar eclipse. So how I understand myself, how I got into this was, if you think about it, at the solar eclipse, you've got this whole darkness, which is the moon, and you got this rim of fire of light around. So I was raised on stories of the Holocaust. I was young with the Cuban Missile Crisis, involved the early years of the final years of the draft. And so I just have this dark heart of darkness about humans and what we do to environment, to each other, but wrapped in privilege. And the privilege gave me this feeling that I should work on this. I wasn't overwhelmed by the fear of what people can do if we don't spiritualize ourselves or we don't work through our multi-generational trauma. So at age 18, I decided to focus my life on psychedelics because I felt that could give us this sense of how we're part of something larger, and that while we have all of our separate identities with our religions, our nationalities, our race, our gender, all of that if we can come from a place that we're all in this together, then we can appreciate differences rather than be scared by it. So it's kind of this political implications of the mystical experience that sort of got me into psychedelics. 10 years after that is when I discovered MDMA. And I thought, wow, this is very much gentle and also profound. And so I felt that MDMA would be the tool to work through the system to bring psychedelics into the mainstream. So I started MAPS in 86, and then in 2014 started the MAPS Public Benefit Corp, which is now Lycos Therapeutics, and we've completed 2 successful phase 3 studies with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And June 4th is the FDA Advisory Committee meeting, and August 11th is when they have to tell us whether MDMA is approved with therapy for PTSD. And so we're quite hopeful that will happen. And we're also interested in ibogaine, cannabis, other things that we want to work through the FDA.
Brilliant. Kabir, go for it.
So my origin story, not nearly as interesting as Rick's, but like many families, a family touched by serious mental illness. My father died by suicide 36 years ago, and it took me most of the next 30 years to come to terms with that. I fell into the pharmaceutical industry, worked my way through there, and for the last few years had been working, leading a company called Otsuka, which was the company that discovered Abilify, commercialized Abilify. Very proud of the fact that Abilify works for some people some of the time, but acutely conscious of the fact that for most people, most of the time, it doesn't work. And the same is true of virtually every other treatment out there for serious mental illness. And as part of that, 5 or 6 years ago, really casting for what could be new paradigmatic changes, therapeutic options for patients, we came across psychedelics, and I say we as the company. We actually then approached Compass because George and Katya had founded the company. We're looking to really build on those foundations. Otsuka ended up making a lead investment in the Series B. I got to know them, and somehow 3 years later, I emerged as the CEO of Compass Pathways, which is what I now am. So Compass is studying psilocybin, and we are currently in phase 3 for treatment-resistant depression, which is a truly horrible phrase, but the best way to think of it is a proxy for chronic refractory depression, for patients who have suffered repeated episodes across the course of their lives, and essentially for whom absolutely nothing is any longer working. So if SSRIs ever did, if augmentation ever did, it certainly doesn't anymore. And those patients today have very, very few options. And what I hope we can do, and we're still in the phase 3, is we can demonstrate robust data through that, as we did in our phase 2B, actually have something that is truly paradigm shifting for some of these patients in terms not only of extreme efficacy and rapid onset, but also durability as well. Clearly, building on pioneers like Rick, we're also very much in the kind of evangelists for the fact that the world needs to change and recognize the value of these medicines as well.
Yeah. Elliot, go for it.
I'm Elliot Cohen. I was one of the co-founders at PillPack. We were a pharmacy that put multiple medications in a packet. It's a pretty trivial thing when you really think about it, just to like stick lots of pills in the same packet. We ultimately got acquired by Amazon in 2018, and then we built Amazon Pharmacy. I think the thing that we learned throughout that process was just how transformational it is when you get all the small details of delivery right. And really two things, one big sort of transformational experience for me was that. It was the idea that in most healthcare delivery, it's not the whiz-bang feature, it's just getting all the small details right. The second piece is you start to realize just how transformational it is when a really good therapy comes to market. Therapy doesn't have to be a drug. There's lots of interventions out there. But when you really get a big new intervention, it really changes the course of how a whole area gets treated. You think about statins, like you think about heart disease kind of, or cardiology sort of pre and post statins, it just looks totally different. Like it's a completely different field when that transformation happens. And started seeing the data come out specifically from the MDMA trial for MAPS. And I'm not a doctor, but my wife's a doctor, and all my close friends are doctors. And I started sending it to all my friends. And they're normally quite skeptical. I think I've never sent a study that didn't get a lot of feedback that was like, yeah, well, I don't know, this is kind of dumb because it probably won't work in this situation or that situation. And I sent them the Nature paper, MAPS Nature paper, and 100% of the people got back to me with, I don't know, man, this thing might be kind of real. I think this might be different. And that was what originally got me really intrigued. I was a friend of AJ's at the time. AJ, thanks for having me up here. And that created an opportunity to invest in what's now Lycos. So that got me pulled even more into the space. A friend of mine, Dave Balter, is leading an effort in Massachusetts for a state initiative that pulled me even deeper into this process. So I just kept getting deeper and deeper. And I think the other big thread for me is like a lot of folks in this space, I'd had my own less formal introduction to psychedelics as a teenager and early adult. And it really changed the course of my life. So I think when I started seeing these studies, it was just very easy to believe that these were going to be transformational interventions and transformational treatments. And I think then because of this experience I'd had at PillPack, really felt that it was an area I wanted to get much more involved. I think just getting the drug approved or just making it legal wasn't going to be enough to get it all the way ultimately to the patient or the consumer who can benefit from it. There's a bunch of these last mile details that are really critical to the delta between it being a transformational treatment and a transformational treatment that a lot of people get to experience in a safe and effective environment.
So Rick, I mean, August is coming up really quick now. This has been nearly probably 40 plus years in the making. Yeah. You've raised hundreds of millions of dollars philanthropically and also through Lycos to get to this point. How are you feeling about everything, and what insights do you have about how the FDA is thinking about their decision this August?
Well, I'm feeling, on the one hand, a really great sense of relief and accomplishment. I think all the signals are that we're getting that it looks like a very good chance that FDA will end up approving. I think it's more a question of how rather than if. At the same time, one of our potential donors talked about how we're on the knife's edge between altruism and capitalism. So I do have my concerns about our patients and their welfare going to stay the most important focus for the pharmaceutical company, or does it switch to be more about return to shareholders and maybe not as much concern about the patients and the therapists? And I also am aware that because basically we could say that I failed to raise all the money from philanthropy, which is what I hope to do. I mean, we need investment capital. So, somewhere in the neighborhood, I would guess, of $300 million or so has been donated to nonprofits in the psychedelic space. But in the last bunch of years, there's been $4 billion into the for-profits. So that's really tremendous, all the research that's going to be done and all the opportunities that are going to be explored for helping patients. So I think from the point of view of the FDA, they really have never regulated psychotherapy. And unlike Johnson & Johnson and Spravato, which was approved without therapy, what we've been saying to the FDA is that really they should think about this as therapy that is enhanced by the psychedelic. Or you could speak about this as the therapeutic support. But whatever it is, it's not just the drug that is the treatment. It's the context And so I think that's challenging for FDA. How do they understand that? How do they regulate that? They don't really regulate psychotherapy, so they're not quite. How do we train the therapists? One of the biggest concerns I have is that, now this might not sound surprising, but therapists who are working with psychedelics, I think, are more effective, and this is what the therapists say, if they've done the same drug that they're giving to their patients. And so that's one of the big concerns. How do we create the context for this to occur when we need to scale up to 20 or 30,000 therapists? We did get a protocol from the FDA for giving therapists an MDMA experience. We wrapped it in some science, and the vast majority of the therapists that were worked on phase 3 had their own MDMA experience. So I think those are the concerns that I have going forward. How do we do that? And the other thing I'll just say is that because the goal has been sort of to be mass mental health, spiritualized humanity, however we understand that, there's been two parallel tracks. One has been drug development, and the other is drug policy reform. So I think that the drug war is counterproductive, and so it doesn't really help with drug abuse. 100,000 plus people die of opiate overdoses stuff. So there's also this little bit of a tension. Will legalization, which is going to come, I think, over the next 10 years, does that impact the business model? In what way? Is it helpful or harmful? And I think I'm a little bit concerned about how some more narrow-minded investors might think that drug policy reform is a problem rather than something that needs to be addressed so that we could really scale this. And we need to move more towards preventative medicine as well. So, if these things are legally available, like is happening with plant medicines in a bunch of different states and cities, then I think more people can have access to this earlier in their lives, earlier in their maybe depression or traumatic histories. And so psychedelics can be part of prevention as well as treatment. So all in all, I think the FDA is very excited to approve breakthrough therapies, and both psilocybin, MDMA, now LSD is also breakthrough therapy. So I think we're going to most likely have good news in August.
That's great. So, Kabir, you've been in pharma for a while, and recently another company in the space, Gilgamesh, signed a large deal with AbbVie, a $2 billion deal. Really the first time that big pharma is stepping down into the space, and $4 billion invested in this space as well. I'd love your insight into that deal, how in your engagement with big pharma, now that you're on the precipice of your own approval or in the process of phase 3, where do you think things stand?
It's a great question. Thanks, AJ. So I think one thing we need to clarify here, so Rick has been working on MDMA, we're working on psilocybin, albeit a synthetic formulation of psilocybin. And right now, my sense is that big pharma is not interested in engaging with these so-called first-generation ones. And that's reasons around IP and so on, and some of the same questions I think that Rick brought up, and I agree with many of those. I think many of the tensions we have around policy reform, around access and so on, and equally Elliot's points that just getting an approval is just the beginning of the next stage of the story. Yes, there is so much more to be done. I think also, if you think about a typical big pharma model in psychiatry today, and I used to run one in Otsuka, you have lots and lots of reps doing lots and lots of detailing with lots of sampling. Nothing that we are doing fits into that model. So fundamentally, what we are doing doesn't fit into that model. Spravato sort of fits into that model because, frankly, you can just detail it and also give out samples, which they've been doing and so on. So I think right now, big pharma I'm completely unsurprised that both Otsuka and AbbVie have gone for the early stage. Sure. First, they've got time. They have pipelines of their own. If it's going to take 10 years to come through, that's fine. Yeah, they think that the IP is more robust and that's important to them. And I think they think, they're going to watch Lycos and hopefully us and some of the companies coming behind us. They're going to watch us either succeed or fail. And based on that, they'll either have to pay not very much money or they're prepared to pay more money when it happens. So, I'm not going to be proved completely wrong by some deal that's announced in the next week, but I don't actually think the big pharma is ready to engage with late-stage psychedelics.
Yeah, we should add, though, that the Gilgamesh deal with AbbVie is for non-psychedelic psychedelics.
That's true.
If that's not a contradiction. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Rick, because they're so focused on scale.
Yeah.
Now, the question of whether the science actually pans out, I think, is extremely interesting. And, there are probably some strong opinions out there. But yeah, you're right, because that's the other thing. Big Pharma is nervous of the subjective experience,
right,
which certainly in the case of psilocybin is at the core of the efficacy.
Yep. I think it actually would be helpful to briefly unpack the distinctions between MDMA and psilocybin. A lot of these psychedelics end up getting bucketed together in that term. Yeah. I mean, Rick, can you explain to the audience just what MDMA is, what the mechanism of action is, and just some details on what the sensation is like while patients are...
Okay. Well, you know how there's a lot of support for plant medicine. So most people think that MDMA doesn't really come from a plant, but we think it does. It just happens to be a manufacturing plant. And so MDMA is a synthetic. It does not appear in nature. It's derivative in a way. There was a drug very popular called MDA in the 60s, which is a little bit like a cross between MDMA and LSD. So MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. Some people don't say it's a psychedelic. They say the classic psychedelics that are the ego-dissolving psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, ibogaine. But I think psychedelic means mind manifesting. So MDMA works on emotions more than the visual, and it reduces activity in the amygdala where we process fear. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex where we think logically. So when you have PTSD, you don't really have time in a way to think. Threats happen, you interpret something as a threat really quickly. And then there's decreased activity in the hippocampus with PTSD where you put memories into long-term storage. So MDMA increases activity in the hippocampus and connectivity with the amygdala, and it releases oxytocin, the hormone of love and connection. You may have heard of the study that Gould Doblin, a researcher at Hopkins, did with octopuses, where if you've seen my octopus teacher, octopuses are solitary creatures, unless it's near the end of their life when it's mating season, then they die. It's kind of a sad life. But when you give MDMA to an octopus, all of a sudden it wants to hang out with other octopuses. And so octopuses do process serotonin. So MDMA is a deep and profound love, connection, self-compassion, and it lasts about 6 hours or so. We believe that the longer the therapy session actually takes place, the more effective it can be. So we give a supplemental dose of half the initial amount after around 2 hours. So we have 8-hour therapy sessions. So our phase 3 design is 42 hours of therapy, 3 MDMA sessions only, each 8 hours, and we use a male-female co-therapy team, not always, sometimes 2 women, occasionally 2 men. And then there's another 18 hours of non-drug psychotherapy for preparation and integration. And so I think it was a strategic choice of all the psychedelics, which I thought would make it through the system first, and it's, I think, the gentleness of the MDMA, even though some of the people that are in our studies say, I don't know why they call this ecstasy.
Sure.
Because it doesn't automatically make you feel love and all your problems go away. It reduces the fear of these traumatic memories so that instead of suppressing them, you can process them. And people can take MDMA or ecstasy at parties and end up worse off. If material emotions come up and you're not in a safe spot to process it and you try to stuff your feelings down after you've kind of impacted the kind of balance that you've had where you've suppressed it and you don't deal with it, we've had people contact us and say that for months or years afterwards, they're worse off. So it's really the safe therapeutic support that helps this process of bringing fear-based memories to the surface that really makes it therapeutic.
Yeah. And so by contrast, psilocybin is a classic psychedelic. Psilocybin and LSD are probably the two that are thought of most often. Psilocybin clearly the most commonly occurring chemical in mushrooms, so-called magic mushrooms. So the dose we're using, which is a 25 milligram synthetic dose, roughly equivalent to 4 to 5 grams of the natural product. And what that produces psilocybin, the key chemical mechanism is 5-HT2A, serotonergic. We don't really understand the MOA. There are a number of different hypotheses around default mode network and so on. But it is a profound inner-directed subjective experience at a high enough dose. What we find is that 25 milligrams, the vast majority of people do have a significant 6 to 8 hour psychedelic experience, hallucinations, ego dissolution, really altered states of consciousness. We use a wonderful scale called the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness, which is used in most psychedelic trials. And what we have demonstrated is that for psilocybin, at least, the intensity of certain elements of the subjective experience is clearly correlated with outcomes in terms of remission from depression. What I have to keep on reminding my team is we've demonstrated it for psilocybin. But clearly for psilocybin, that is the mechanism. What that also means, to pick up on something Rick mentioned earlier, is though there is a therapist in the room, in practice, with that sort of inner-directed experience, there's very little for the therapist to do. So we are not offering directed therapy. We are offering what we call psychological support. In the US right now, for FDA regulations, it needs to be a licensed therapist in the room. In Europe, even in a trial context, it can be a nurse, and we've actually used psychiatric nurses in some of those, but it's really about putting the patient at ease. That said, preparation and integration, as Rick referred to, are also critical to an experience with psilocybin. In particular, preparation. We need to have the check the day before that people are in the right frame of mind and so on. 70% of the patients in our trials have a lifetime history of suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. You clearly don't want somebody actively suicidal going through a profoundly, potentially traumatic experience. So elements like preparation and integration and so on are important. And again, that's just, to link back to something Rick said earlier, that's why we, Compass, are following clinical trials, raised hundreds of millions of dollars, investing to get FDA approval and ensure that safeguards are put around how this is used, particularly for people with serious illness.
Yeah, I should just add that we've also looked at this correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes, and we do not see that with MDMA for PTSD. So it's one of the major distinction between the work with the classic psychedelics for all the different clinical indications. There does seem to be this correlation, but that's not the case for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD.
So Elliot, I can't think of anyone better positioned to comment on the go-to-market for these drugs. Let's assume both get approved. Spravato recently approved a few years ago. We've got 42 million patients taking an antidepressant right now every day. We've got 35 million people that have TRD, 13 million people with PTSD. We've got payers involved, insurers involved, we've got therapists involved. It really is unbelievably complicated to get this stuff to scale. I'd love your thoughts on how to do it.
There's so many different components, but I think you can break them down into a couple of different sort of chunks. One, insurance in the U.S. is one of the greatest enablers of equity in healthcare. It helps everybody be able to afford a medication. So this is the whole value of going through the FDA with these compounds is it helps us plug them into the insurance infrastructure and make them available to everybody else. That's what's so great about it. The downside of it is it comes with a ton of rules. And to some extent it should. We're using a lot of public dollars. About 50 cents of every dollar in insurance today in the US is coming from a federal or a state government. So it's pretty reasonable for us to add a lot of rules to it, but we do. And in mental health, that's going to be especially challenging because we don't have great definitions of the disease states. We get them from a handbook we call the DSM, which we change all the time, as everybody knows. And so we don't have good ways to think about who's even really fully eligible or not. We obviously have a definition that comes from these trials, but I think you're going to see that change over time. And so step one is just how do you marry up what insurance is telling you is allowed and not allowed with what the provider's actually doing and try to make that a seamless consumer experience. So getting that right is going to be step one. Probably a bigger step two is helping the therapy and psychedelic and psychiatry community adapt their delivery mechanisms. We're going from a world where almost everything in psychiatry today is about stability. It's like, how do I get you to a stable dose of an SSRI, a stable dose of a therapy regimen, and then just keep you there? And everything about psychedelics is not that. It's How do I get you into this intensive episode of care? I'm hoping that in that intensive episode, you move from A to B in your progression. Hopefully we can use words like remission or cure, but even if we can't, we want you to really shift in some meaningful way. That's going to require much more intensive episodes. I sort of think a lot about like what cancer looked like 20 or 30 years ago. We went from a world where we were just delivering medical oncology treatments and surgical oncology treatments independently of each other into a world where it's really important to coordinate the radiation with the surgery, with the medication. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in these spaces. We need to get the psychiatry and the therapy community and the drug delivery infrastructure to all sort of play concert with each other. I think the last big piece of this, and this kind of gets back to this comment about the DSM, we have such poor definitions of who are the right people for these treatments to begin with. I'm always passionate about trying to enable the consumer to take more ownership of their own care. And one place where we really make that difficult is getting medication. And so I think we need as many pathways for a consumer to raise their hand and say, I think this might be good for me. How do I figure out if the answer to that's yes or no? And you think about any highly specialized treatment today, we make you go to your PCP first. That probably takes a month or two. Your PCP sends you to a more specialized person. That takes another 3 or 4 months. Insurance is probably going to tell you need to fail a couple other treatments before you get to these treatments that might really work. That could be a year of really active management just to get to the place where you get to try the treatment. And that assumes every doctor along the way agreed with you. That's a crazy system. Like, that's probably not how it should work.
Yeah.
A lot of what we did when I was still at Amazon was about trying to build tools to make it easier for these consumers to say, I want to try this and try to cut a more direct pathway. It's got to be safe and effective. You have to think deeply about how their care providers get woven into this, but you should be streamlining that as much as possible. So I think we have to figure out how to get each of those 3 areas to play nicely with each other.
Yeah, there's actually another really big factor for scaling, which is going to be moving to group therapy and trying to investigate that. Because now for the FDA too, we are working with individual patients, but Lykos is starting to look at group therapy. We've just raised a couple $1 million to do group therapy in Israel with 400 people. So I think that if that can get outcomes that are somewhat similar or as good as the individual therapy, that will be a real key to scaling.
And to my understanding, I mean, there's a few 100,000 order of magnitude licensed therapists in the United States, and they're going to have to be upskilled too, right? I know you guys have your own training programs. I mean, Elliot, I'd love to hear from you about, hey, what do we do here? How do we get therapists who are very much so at the epicenter of the story, upskilled and aware of this next wave coming down the pike?
I'm probably a little cynical in this viewpoint. I mean, I think if you make it really profitable, they'll do it.
Sure.
So, we have lots of rules in our system that are designed to make the profit pools live in only one spot, and they don't really make any sense. You take something like Stark as sort of the main law we rely on, and it makes sense in one view. You're like, yeah, we shouldn't incentivize our prescribers to prescribe a certain thing. Totally rational. Like, how could you possibly argue with that? The flip side is, all of our rules around things like 340B that are directly designed to support a broader patient population create a massive economic incentive for a provider to prescribe on the 340B program. And when you start digging through healthcare, you just see lots and lots of those. I think at the end of the day, the thing that will probably work the best here is to find high quality providers, hold them to a high standard around that, but also you got to make it profitable, or why would they do it? And when this first comes out, that's a lot of what I mean about the reorganization. It's going to be less profitable, not more profitable probably, to do this, because it'll be new and it'll be hard and it'll require totally different operations inside that clinic. So just getting to the place where you can do it well. And you're taking a patient that would have theoretically stayed, you think of this like a SaaS software company. You're shifting it from a world where your customer was going to stay with you forever to a world where they're going to have an intensive 3 or 4 months with you and may or may not, hopefully, don't come back.
Sure.
So you're making it objectively a worse business for them by one viewpoint. And so I think we have to do a lot to think about how to make that a really viable business for them. And I think if you do that, of course, you have to have great training programs, but I think you'll find people raising their hand and dying to spend lots of time and energy becoming exceptional world-class therapists if there's a nice profit incentive at the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good segue to the final question I had today. I mean, we're at an investment conference fundamentally, right? And we've all here made the case for investing in psychedelic therapies. I would love to just hear, what is that case for each one, both Lykos, Compass, and what you're working on?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with one of the things that pharma has talked about is an ideal thing called a pipeline in a pill. so that you have one thing, one pill, but it can do many, many different things. So when we talk about MDMA-assisted therapy, and people say, what is it good for? Well, we've demonstrated, I think, 2 successful phase 3 studies in PTSD. We have yet to study people with depression who don't also have PTSD. There's incredible early pilot data that we have for autistic adults with social anxiety. There's so many, many different things that MDMA can be used for that I think that makes Lykos a really good investment, because and not only that, but there's 350 plus million people around the world with PTSD. It's just an enormous need. And also when we are working on our evaluation, we kind of did it at one of the low points in investment. So I think in particular we are further along and have a lower valuation than these other companies. So that makes it also especially good investment.
So thanks, Rick. There are other companies with a higher market cap than me right now as well. That's a separate issue. But no, I think first, that value of a pipeline, I think, is absolutely there. And again, psilocybin, there are clearly small studies across a whole range of areas, including something we haven't talked about, which is SUD, which is clearly a huge problem. Yeah. And I think, again, SUD is going to be one of the next big frontiers for psychedelics. The other thing, though, I would say specifically talking about both Lykos and Compass is these trials are not like other clinical trials. It is much, much harder to run trials for Schedule 1 products with psychological support or therapy than it is to run trials for classic novel orals. And, so far we're the only 2 companies that have demonstrated the capability to actually run disciplined, robust, large-scale trials in psychedelics. And again, not to say that others can't get there, and I hope that plenty of others do, but Lykos and Compass Pathways are the only 2 companies that have got there so far.
Yeah.
My view is a little more at an ecosystem level than Kabir and Rick, but I don't think you could go wrong. Like, I think you couldn't stumble and not make money in this space if we're even a little bit right. This would be like if when the sort of modern round of oncology products started coming out 20, 30 years ago, like, could you have made money? You couldn't have gotten it wrong. Yeah. Like, the drug companies did great. All the care providers did amazingly well. Like, the insurance companies actually did really, like, there's nobody in the ecosystem that did poorly. If we're right, and these really are a transformational way to approach mental health, then you couldn't possibly invest wrong. Yeah. And the only thing you could do wrong is to not participate. And at its root, that's because there's really great need. And these look like a really effective new way to do that. And so if those 2 theses are right, then you should be investing in the space. You'll make money.
I think that's a perfect way to close. With that, Rick, Kabir, Elliot, good to see you guys. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having us.